Ma'am, this is a routine traffic stop. Please comply with my instructions.
Routine? You followed me for 6 blocks.
We've had reports of drug activity with vehicles matching this description.
What description? Black woman in a nice car. I'm DEA Agent Chloe Vance, and you just compromised my surveillance operation.
Anyone can buy a fake badge. You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer.
Are you kidding me?
Officer Dean Sawyer thought he was making a drug bust that would advance his career. Instead, he just arrested the federal agent whose undercover operation he'd blown, whose investigation he compromised, and whose lawsuit would soon prove that some assumptions cost more than just embarrassment. Quick pause. I love seeing how global our community is getting. Let me know in the comments. Which part of the world are you tuning in from today? Also, if you value independent storytelling that digs deeper for the truth, please hit that subscribe button. Your support is the only way we can keep exposing these untold stories. It was 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Interstate 17, creating waves of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Traffic moved steadily through the urban corridor, where legitimate businesses mixed with areas known for drug activity. Agent Chloe Vance had been driving this route for 3 months, building her cover, mapping the network, getting closer to the breakthrough that would dismantle one of the Southwest's most sophisticated trafficking operations. She drove a black Mercedes C-Class, leased under her undercover identity. The car was expensive enough to fit in with mid-level dealers, but not so flashy as to attract unwanted attention. Or so she thought. Today, it had attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention from Officer Dean Sawyer, who had been following her since she'd left a suspected stash house on Van Buren Street. Sawyer had been with the Phoenix Police Department for 6 years. 6 years of patrolling the same beats, making the same assumptions, building the same prejudices. When he saw the Mercedes pull away from a house they'd had under surveillance, driven by a black woman who looked too young and too put together for the neighborhood, his mind made the calculation it always made. Expensive car, wrong neighborhood, black driver, must be drugged. He'd followed her for 6 blocks, watching her drive normally, signal properly, obey every traffic law, but in his mind, that just made her more suspicious. Professional criminals were careful drivers. They didn't give police reasons to pull them over, except Sawyer had decided she needed to be pulled over anyway. The Mercedes had Georgia plates, which Sawyer noted as another red flag. Out-of-state vehicles were often used to transport drugs between distribution hubs. He didn't know that the plates were part of Vance's carefully constructed cover identity, designed to make her appear to be an out-of-town buyer connecting with local suppliers. When Sawyer finally activated his emergency lights, Vance immediately understood what was happening. She'd been a DEA agent for 12 years. She'd seen racial profiling from both sides, had testified in cases where officers made stops based on assumptions rather than evidence. She'd hoped her professional appearance and careful driving would protect her, but she'd also prepared for this possibility. She pulled over safely, turned off the engine, and placed her hands on the steering wheel where Sawyer could see them. Standard procedure for anyone stopped by police, but especially important for a black woman who knew how quickly these situations could escalate. Sawyer approached the driver's side window, his hand resting on his service weapon. He'd already run her plates through the system. The vehicle came back clean, registered to Chloe Vance with a Georgia address. No warrants, no flags, no legitimate reason for the stop beyond his suspicions. "Ma'am, this is a routine traffic stop. Please comply with my instructions." Vance turned to face him, her expression controlled, but questioning. "Routine? You followed me for 6 blocks. We've had reports of drug activity with vehicles matching this description." "What description? Black woman in a nice car?" Sawyer's jaw tightened. He'd heard this before. The accusation that his stops were racially motivated. His training had taught him to deflect, to focus on the investigation, to maintain control of the situation. "Don't make this about race. We're investigating real crimes here." Vance felt the familiar mixture of professional frustration and personal anger. She was investigating real crimes too, had been for months, had risked her safety going undercover in dangerous situations to build cases against the very criminals Sawyer claimed to be pursuing. "So am I. I'm DEA Agent Chloe Vance, and you just compromised my surveillance operation." She reached slowly into her jacket pocket, careful to keep her movements visible, and withdrew her federal credentials. Black leather case, gold badge, official identification card with her photograph and DEA seal clearly visible. Sawyer looked at the badge, his mind processing what he was seeing. Federal credentials looked authentic, but he'd been trained to be suspicious of everything. Drug dealers had access to sophisticated fake IDs. They had the money to buy convincing replicas of law enforcement badges. Anyone can buy a fake badge. You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer. Vance stared at him in disbelief. She was holding legitimate federal credentials, had identified herself as a DEA agent, had explained that she was conducting an undercover operation, and Sawyer was choosing to arrest her rather than verify her identity with a simple radio call. Officer, you can verify my credentials with one phone call. Contact Phoenix DEA field office. Ask for Agent Leo Maxwell. He's my supervisor. Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them. Vance complied, moving slowly and deliberately. She knew that resisting would only make the situation worse, but she also knew that what was happening was not just wrong, it was catastrophically stupid. Sawyer was about to arrest a federal agent, compromise an ongoing investigation, and expose himself and his department to liability that would end careers and cost millions. Officer Sawyer, she said, reading his name tag, I'm complying with your instructions, but I need you to understand what you're doing. I'm a federal agent. This is my undercover vehicle. I've been working this area for 3 months, building a case against the drug network you claim to be investigating. If you arrest me, you're going to blow my cover and destroy months of work. Sawyer pulled out his handcuffs. Turn around. Hands behind your back. The metal clicked around her wrists, tight enough to be uncomfortable. Vance had put handcuffs on hundreds of suspects during her career. She'd never imagined she'd feel them on her own wrists, placed there by a local cop too stubborn or too biased to make a simple verification call. You're making the biggest mistake of your career, she said quietly, as Sawyer led her toward his patrol car. We'll see about that, he replied. But as he placed her in the back seat and called for backup to secure her vehicle, Sawyer had no idea how right she was. In the next hour, his career would effectively end. Within weeks, the city would be facing a federal lawsuit that would cost $4.2 million, and Agent Chloe Vance would become the center of a case study in how racial profiling and professional arrogance can destroy lives, careers, and entire investigations in a single afternoon. Agent Chloe Vance had dedicated 12 years of her life to fighting the war on drugs. 12 years of dangerous undercover work, complex investigations, and putting her life on the line to dismantle criminal organizations that poisoned communities across America. At 34 years old, she was one of the DEA's most skilled undercover operatives, specializing in long-term infiltration of sophisticated drug trafficking networks. She graduated from Howard University with a degree in criminal justice, then immediately joined the DEA after completing her training at Quantico. Her first assignment had been in Miami, where she'd spent 3 years learning the basics of narcotics investigation while working cases involving cocaine trafficking from South America. She'd proven herself capable, intelligent, and fearless in situations that would terrify most people. From Miami, she transferred to Atlanta, where she'd specialized in undercover work targeting methamphetamine distribution networks throughout the Southeast. For 4 years, she'd assumed false identities, built relationships with criminals, gathered evidence that resulted in dozens of arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in drugs and assets. Her supervisors consistently rated her performance as exceptional. Her current assignment in Phoenix represented the culmination of her career development. She was leading Operation Desert Storm, a multi-agency investigation targeting a sophisticated drug trafficking organization that moved heroin, fentanyl, and methamphetamine from Mexico through Arizona to distribution points across the western United States. The organization was responsible for thousands of overdose deaths and generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits annually. Vance had been building her undercover identity for 6 months before moving to Phoenix. She created a backstory as a mid-level dealer from Atlanta looking to establish connections with Southwestern suppliers. She'd rented an apartment, established credit, built relationships, all while gathering intelligence on how the organization operated. The house Sawyer had seen her leaving was a key piece of the investigation. She'd identified it as a stash house where the organization stored drugs before distribution. She'd been working for weeks to gain access, to understand the security procedures, to identify the key players who controlled the operation. Today's visit had been a breakthrough. She'd finally gained the trust necessary to see how the operation functioned. The Mercedes she drove was registered under her false identity and paid for with DEA funds. Everything about her cover had been carefully designed to withstand scrutiny from criminals who were naturally suspicious of law enforcement. What she hadn't anticipated was being profiled by local police who couldn't imagine a black woman legitimately driving an expensive car. Officer Dean Sawyer's record told a different story. In 6 years with the Phoenix Police Department, he generated 14 formal complaints. 11 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or excessive force against people of color. The pattern was unmistakable, but the department had never connected the dots in any meaningful way. Complaint number 1 came just 8 months into his career. Sawyer had stopped a black businessman leaving a bank, convinced he'd just committed a robbery. The man was a corporate executive who'd been making a deposit. The complaint was filed, investigated, and dismissed with a notation that Sawyer needed better judgment in assessing suspicious behavior. Complaint number 3 involved a Hispanic family driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. Sawyer pulled them over, demanded identification from everyone in the vehicle, and called for backup to search their car. They were visiting relatives. The complaint resulted in mandatory diversity training that Sawyer completed, but apparently never internalized. Complaint number 7 was filed by a black college student who'd been stopped while walking through a shopping center parking lot. Sawyer had detained him for 45 minutes, convinced he was casing vehicles to break into. The student was walking to his job at a restaurant in the same shopping center. The complaint was sustained, resulting in a written reprimand that went into Sawyer's file and was promptly forgotten. By complaint number 11, the pattern was undeniable. Sawyer consistently targeted people of color in situations where white people wouldn't have been questioned. He interpreted normal behavior as suspicious when performed by minorities. He escalated encounters unnecessarily and showed no ability to learn from training or discipline. His supervisors had noted in performance evaluations that Sawyer was enthusiastic and had good arrest statistics, but sometimes lacked judgment in determining when stops were justified. They recommended additional training which Sawyer attended, but his behavior never changed. The department's response to each complaint was the same: more training, more counseling, more chances to improve. What none of Sawyer's supervisors understood was that his targeting of minorities wasn't a training issue or a judgment problem. It was a fundamental belief system that saw black and Hispanic people as inherently criminal, as people who didn't belong in nice cars or affluent neighborhoods or any space where Sawyer thought they stood out. That belief system had been reinforced by 6 years of making stops that occasionally resulted in arrests, giving Sawyer the impression that his instincts were correct. He didn't see the dozens of innocent people he'd harassed. He only remembered the few times his suspicions had been validated, convincing him that racial profiling was effective police work. Sergeant Eliza Kennedy had supervised Sawyer for 2 years and had grown increasingly concerned about his pattern of stops. She'd recommended that he be reassigned to duties that didn't involve traffic enforcement, but her supervisor had overruled her. The department was short-staffed and Sawyer's arrest statistics looked good on paper. Kennedy had warned Sawyer repeatedly about making stops without probable cause. She'd explained the legal standards for reasonable suspicion. She'd sent him to additional training on constitutional policing and bias recognition. But Sawyer had absorbed none of it. In his mind, he was a good cop making good arrests, and the complaints were just criminals trying to avoid accountability. Chief Simon Barrett had reviewed Sawyer's file during annual personnel evaluations and had noted the pattern of complaints, but each individual complaint had been investigated and most had been dismissed or resulted in minor discipline. Barrett had never connected them into the obvious pattern they formed when viewed together. The department's complaint tracking system wasn't designed to identify patterns across time. Each complaint was handled individually by internal affairs, resulting in individual dispositions that never added up to the bigger picture. No one had the responsibility or authority to look at Sawyer's record holistically and recognize that 14 complaints in 6 years indicated an officer who shouldn't be on the street. That afternoon, when Sawyer pulled over Agent Chloe Vance, he was operating under the same assumptions that had generated 14 previous complaints. He saw a black woman in an expensive car and assumed criminality. He ignored evidence that contradicted his assumptions. He escalated when he should have verified, and he was about to learn that some targets of racial profiling have the resources and authority to fight back in ways that destroy careers and cost cities millions of dollars. The collision between Vance's federal authority and Sawyer's unchecked bias was about to expose not just one officer's prejudices, but an entire department's failure to address a pattern that had been obvious for years. What Officer Dean Sawyer didn't understand as he placed Agent Chloe Vance in handcuffs was that he just destroyed 6 months of meticulous federal police work. Operation Desert Storm wasn't just another drug investigation. It was a multi-million-dollar federal operation targeting the Morales trafficking organization, one of the most sophisticated drug networks operating between Mexico and the United States. The Morales organization moved over 200 kilograms of heroin and fentanyl through Phoenix every month. They were responsible for supplying dealers in 12 states, generating an estimated $50 million in annual revenue. More importantly, their product was killing people. The CDC had linked over 300 overdose deaths in the past year to drugs that originated with the Morales network. Agent Leo Maxwell, Vance's supervisor at the Phoenix DEA field office, had been planning Operation Desert Storm for 2 years. The investigation involved not just the DEA, but the FBI, Border Patrol, and local agencies, including the Phoenix Police Department. The operation had cost the federal government over $800,000 in personnel, equipment, and undercover expenses. Vance's role in the investigation was critical. She'd spent months building relationships with mid-level dealers, gaining their trust, learning their procedures. She'd identified key players, mapped supply routes, documented money laundering operations. Her undercover work had provided investigators with evidence that would have resulted in federal indictments against 43 members of the organization. The stash house Sawyer had seen her leaving contained approximately 30 kilograms of heroin and 15 kilograms of fentanyl. Vance had been inside that house for the first time that afternoon, gathering intelligence on security procedures, identifying personnel, documenting evidence. She'd been planning to return the following week with surveillance equipment that would have provided real-time intelligence for a coordinated raid. Sawyer's traffic stop had blown her cover completely. Within minutes of her arrest, word would spread through the criminal network that someone matching her description had been detained by police after leaving the stash house. The organization's security protocols would activate immediately. The stash house would be abandoned, the drugs moved, the personnel relocated. 6 months of work would be lost. Evidence would disappear. Suspects would flee. The opportunity to dismantle the entire organization would evaporate because a local police officer had made assumptions based on race rather than evidence. Maxwell received the call about Vance's arrest at 4:15 p.m. His first reaction was disbelief. One of his most experienced agents, operating with full federal authority, had been arrested by local police for impersonating a federal officer. His second reaction was rage. The Phoenix Police Department had been briefed about Operation Desert Storm. They'd been specifically instructed to avoid any enforcement action in the target area without coordinating with federal agents. The briefing had been conducted 3 weeks earlier in the conference room at Phoenix PD headquarters. Chief Simon Barrett had attended personally, along with his command staff. Maxwell had explained the operation, identified the target areas, provided contact information for immediate consultation if local officers encountered anything suspicious.
Sawyer had missed that briefing.
He'd been attending his mandatory bias training that day, learning about constitutional policing and reasonable suspicion. The irony would have been amusing if the consequences hadn't been so devastating. By 5:00 p.m., Maxwell had mobilized a response team to assess the damage. By 6:00 p.m., surveillance confirmed that the stash house had been abandoned. By 7:00 p.m., intercepted communications indicated that the entire Morales network was implementing security protocols, assuming law enforcement had compromised their operations. Operation Desert Storm was dead. Killed by racial profiling disguised as police work, Agent Leo Maxwell's phone call to Chief Simon Barrett at 4:30 p.m. that Thursday afternoon was brief and devastating. "Chief, one of your officers just arrested my undercover agent and destroyed a 6-month federal investigation. We need to talk. Now." Barrett's stomach dropped as Maxwell explained the situation. Agent Chloe Vance was sitting in a Phoenix PD holding cell charged with impersonating a federal officer, while a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking organization implemented security protocols that would make them unreachable for months or possibly years. Barrett immediately ordered Vance's release and dispatched Sergeant Eliza Kennedy to personally escort her from the jail. Kennedy had supervised Sawyer and had seen his pattern of problematic stops. She'd recommended his reassignment multiple times, warnings that had been ignored by command staff more concerned with staffing levels than constitutional policing. When Kennedy arrived at the jail, she found Vance sitting calmly in a holding cell, still wearing her red blazer and maintaining the professional composure that had carried her through 12 years of dangerous undercover work. But behind her controlled expression was a federal agent whose investigation had been destroyed and whose safety had been compromised by a local officer's racial bias. Agent Vance, I'm Sergeant Kennedy. I cannot apologize enough for what happened today. You're being released immediately, and Officer Sawyer has been suspended pending investigation. Vance stood slowly, her wrists still bearing marks from Sawyer's handcuffs. Sergeant, this isn't just about an apology. Your officer didn't just arrest me. He destroyed months of work that could have saved lives. The Morales organization is responsible for hundreds of overdose deaths, and they're going to slip away because Officer Sawyer saw a black woman in a Mercedes and assumed I was a criminal. The media response was immediate and explosive. By 6 p.m., local news stations were reporting that Phoenix PD had arrested a DEA agent conducting an undercover operation. By 8 p.m., national news outlets had picked up the story. By midnight, social media was filled with body camera footage, showing Sawyer refusing to verify Vance's credentials and arresting her despite her federal authority. The footage was devastating to watch. Vance remained professional throughout the encounter, clearly identifying herself, offering to have her credentials verified, explaining that she was conducting an undercover operation. Sawyer ignored every piece of evidence that contradicted his assumptions, choosing to arrest rather than investigate. Civil rights organizations responded within hours. The NAACP issued a statement condemning the arrest as a clear example of racial profiling that had compromised public safety. The National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives called for Sawyer's immediate termination and a federal investigation into Phoenix PD's practices. The DEA's response was swift and unambiguous. Maxwell held a press conference the following morning, flanked by federal prosecutors and FBI officials. Agent Vance is a decorated federal law enforcement officer with 12 years of distinguished service. Her arrest by Phoenix PD was based solely on racial profiling and has compromised a major federal investigation into drug trafficking that threatens communities across the Southwest. Phoenix PD's initial response was defensive and tone-deaf. Their first statement suggested that Sawyer had followed proper procedures for verifying credentials and that the arrest was an unfortunate misunderstanding. The statement ignored the obvious fact that Sawyer had refused to verify Vance's credentials and had arrested her specifically for possessing them. That statement lasted less than 6 hours before Barrett personally retracted it and issued a new response acknowledging that serious errors in judgment had occurred and promising a thorough investigation of Sawyer's actions. But the damage was accelerating. Federal prosecutors announced they were reviewing whether to bring civil rights charges against Sawyer. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into whether Phoenix PD had a pattern of discriminatory policing. The DEA suspended all cooperative operations with Phoenix PD pending a review of their procedures. Vance retained attorney Sarah Martinez, a civil rights lawyer specializing in police misconduct cases. Martinez had successfully litigated dozens of cases involving racial profiling, securing millions in settlements for victims whose rights had been violated by law enforcement. This case represents the intersection of racial profiling and the war on drugs. Martinez said at a press conference announcing Vance's federal lawsuit, Officer Sawyer saw a black woman and assumed criminality, ignoring evidence and professional identification that should have immediately ended this encounter. His actions didn't just violate Agent Vance's civil rights. They compromised public safety by destroying an investigation targeting drug dealers who are killing people with fentanyl. The lawsuit, filed in federal court 3 weeks after the arrest, was comprehensive and devastating. It named Sawyer individually, his supervisors who had ignored 14 previous complaints, and the Phoenix Police Department for maintaining policies that enable discriminatory policing. The complaint documented Sawyer's history of racial profiling, the department's failure to address his pattern of misconduct, and the specific harm caused by arresting a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation. The lawsuit sought $4.2 million in damages, reflecting both the personal harm to Vance and the broader cost of the compromised investigation. Barrett knew immediately that the case was indefensible. The body camera footage showed everything. Vance had been professional, cooperative, and clearly identified as a federal agent. Sawyer had ignored evidence, refused to verify credentials, and arrested someone whose authority exceeded his own. Internal Affairs launched their investigation, but the outcome was predetermined. Sawyer had violated department policy, federal law, and basic principles of constitutional policing. His career was effectively over, and the city was facing a lawsuit that would cost millions while exposing years of ignored warning signs. The settlement negotiations lasted 4 months, but the outcome was never in doubt. Phoenix City attorneys reviewed the body camera footage, Sawyer's complaint history, and the federal investigation damage, reaching an inevitable conclusion. The case was catastrophically indefensible. In March, the city agreed to pay Agent Chloe Vance $4.2 million, one of the largest police misconduct settlements in Arizona history. The agreement included no admission of wrongdoing, but the dollar amount spoke louder than any legal disclaimer. Officer Dean Sawyer was terminated 6 weeks after the arrest. His termination letter was comprehensive and final. Officer Sawyer engaged in racial profiling of a federal agent, refused to verify legitimate credentials, and compromised a major drug investigation. His pattern of discriminatory conduct, documented through 14 complaints over 6 years, demonstrates unfitness for law enforcement. Sawyer's name was entered into the National Decertification Index, permanently ending his law enforcement career. He filed no appeal, released no statement, and disappeared from public view. Judge Caroline Jensen, who approved the settlement, issued a scathing opinion. This case represents the predictable outcome when law enforcement agencies ignore patterns of discriminatory conduct. Officer Sawyer's 14 complaints should have triggered intervention years ago. Phoenix PD implemented sweeping reforms. Officers with 3 or more similar complaints now face automatic review for termination. All traffic stops in federal investigation areas require supervisor approval. Body camera footage is reviewed within 24 hours of any arrest involving credential disputes. Agent Vance returned to undercover work, though Operation Desert Storm was never recovered. The Morales organization relocated, costing the DEA years of investigative work and allowing dangerous drugs to continue flowing into American communities. Chief Simon Barrett testified before the city council, "We failed Agent Vance, we failed our community, and we failed the federal partners who trusted us to support their operations. This will never happen again." The case became required training material for police departments nationwide, a cautionary tale about the costs of ignoring racial bias and the consequences of targeting federal agents who happen to be black women driving nice cars. And if you believe that silence is the enemy of justice and that the truth deserves a spotlight, then please hit that subscribe button. We are committed to uncovering these harsh realities. We are committed to standing up for the innocent, the agents, the professionals, the everyday citizens who just want to do their jobs in peace without harassment. This goes beyond just one bad interaction or one viral moment. It's about deciding what kind of society we refuse to tolerate any longer.